and there is a road book still extant, which they also microfilmed. And the road book shows where the road districts went. And Road District 26 started in about the middle of the village of Palmyra on Main Street and ran west almost to the western edge of the present township of Palmyra, and then went south. And at first, Joseph Smith's name appears at the western end of Main Street, because if you know where people's property were, and you can tell that from the tax assessment rolls, as well as by looking at the individual names and looking up property in their deed books, you find that the names are listed just about in the order that you'd follow if you went down Main Street and then turned south. And Joseph Smith Sr.'s name appears at the west end of Main Street at the time. His name appears again in District 26 in 1818, again in 1819, and then in 1820, Alvin's name shows up along with his, because Alvin had become 21. Mm-hmm. And then in the following year, in 22, in 21, Alvin, Hiram, and Joseph Sr. all appear because Hiram had turned 21 in that year. So then the following year, Hiram isn't there. He may have been working on some other farm in some other township, hired out as a hired hand someplace. But Hiram isn't there, but Alvin's still there, and so is Joseph Sr., and they're still on District 26 in Palmyra. So as late as April, when these lists were made up, of 1822, you have Joseph Smith still living in the township of Palmyra, but now down the south end of the road district, which would put him fairly close to the dividing line between Palmyra Township and Manchester Township. So all of that agrees very decidedly with the assessment records for the township of Manchester, which shows that Joseph didn't even contract for the land in Manchester until sometime after July of 1820. Now, a further thing about the assessment records, jumping over to Manchester again, to those tax records, the further thing is that when the property went on to the tax rolls of Joseph Smith, for Joseph Smith in 1821, the assessed value was $700. Now, I spent quite a bit of time looking at land prices from that period. I went through the Phelps and Gorham papers, and they were selling property all over the place, all around there. They were the big first land office in the United States was just 13 miles from Palmyra down at Canandaigua, and Phelps and Gorham had opened a land office there, and before the turn of the century, before 1800, and they continued on for a number of years beyond that, selling property, and you have property being sold by Phelps in 18, 19, 20, 21, all around in that area. So this gives us an idea of what raw, uncultivated, unimproved land was selling for, and land there sold anywhere between $6 and highest $10 an acre for unimproved land. So $7 is about the average that a person would pay for just raw land. Now, the trees had to be cut, and then you had to put up your cabin and get your crop started and so on. So knowing the slowness of the process and noticing that $700 was assessed for 1821 and the same amount for 1822, it would appear that nothing had been improved on the land by the summer of 22. But the tax record for July of 1823 shows that the assessed value had jumped by $300 to $1,000. So that's when their cabin went up, and they finally got enough land cleared to move on to the property. And that agrees perfectly with the Palmyra road tax records, which shows they were still in the township of Palmyra until after at least April of 22, and the assessment records would push it to after July of 22. So they didn't move on the property until sometime after the summer of 22.
Okay, now let's make sure everyone understands. The Mormon story says that they moved onto this land in 1818.
Well, that's the way the historians tried to harmonize the difficulty in Joseph's account.
Okay, and yet the information that you have uncovered makes it look very clear that they did not actually move on to that land until 4 years later, which would be 1822.
That's correct.
Okay, we need to take a brief break right now, and when we come back, I want to ask you about some questions about what the significance of warning out is, and a couple more questions on this subject, and then we'll open up the phone lines and maybe talk to some folks who might have some questions for you about this subject, 278-5550. And welcome back to Dividing Line. My name is James White. I'm the director of Alpha and Omega Ministries. Along with me, Mike Beliveau, the president of Alpha and Omega. And on the phone, Reverend Wesley Walters. We are talking about historical research into the background of the first vision of Joseph Smith as contained in Joseph Smith's history and the Pearl of Great Price, part of Mormon scripture. And we are talking about the differences between the basically the historical scenario that the LDS Church is forced into by Joseph Smith's own statements, his claim that the revival took place in 1820 and that he had the first vision in 1820. The differences between that and the story that is now coming out relevant to the actual facts of the matter when the Smiths actually moved from one place to another. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about, Wesley, was the subject of warning out. Tell us about what's it meant to be warned out of a town and what significance this has to the subject we're discussing today.
The term warning out was a common term that was used in New England throughout the New England states up until about 1819, around then when it went out. It stems from an old English understanding that the local town was responsible for its poor. Now, in a area that is experiencing the migration of peoples into the territory, some of whom are not well funded, there was a danger of dozens of people coming in and being unable to make a living and becoming destitute, in which case the local towns were expected to care for these. Now, if the burden got too great, it could bankrupt the people of the town that already were living there and established. So right in the late 1780s, the New England states began to pass laws that if you warned out a group of immigrants, any particular family that moved into the area, within 3 months of their arrival, that and they became destitute, you weren't responsible for them. You could charge the town they came from with the cost of transporting them back there, and they would be their